The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was a key event in World War II. It caused the United States to abandon its isolationist policy and join the Second World War. Furthermore, it marked the beginning of war in the Pacific, making the war a true world war. But what happened on December 7, 1941? Why did Japan attack? And what role did the United States play in the war once she joined? The rivalry between Japan and the United States began in the 1920s, when Japan began to dominate trade in the Far East and the Pacific, a market the United States wanted to expand into. In addition, powerful Japanese military leaders such as General Hideki Tojo called for a Japanese empire in mainland Asia, which worried people in mainland Asia and Americans alike. Until the Great Depression, the US was able to limit Japan's influence, but from 1929 onwards, Americans were too focused on problems at home, and in 1931, Japan could invade Manchuria. There, the Japanese established a puppet state, the Empire of Manchukuo. In 1936, Germany and Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact, and Italy joined in 1937. President Roosevelt worried about these three very aggressive nations forming an alliance, yet he didn't want to risk war and didn't take action. In 1937, the Japanese launched a full-scale war on China. Japan's invasion of China was very successful and also made it much easier for her to attack the British, French, and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia, which were largely unprotected as most troops were at war in Europe. The Japanese government planned to expand her empire in these European colonies. This empire was later called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, although it turned out to only benefit Japan. The Japanese expansionism worried President Roosevelt, who needed to keep the Philippines safe, which were in American territory at the time. However, until war broke out in Europe, the American public was isolationist and wanted America to stay out of any international conflicts. In the meantime, Germany, Japan, and Italy were preparing for a war with the United States. After the outbreak of war in Europe, they signed the Three-Power Pact of 1940, which stated that they will assist one another with all political, economical, and military means when one of the three parties is at war with a power at present not involved in the European War or the Chinese-Japanese conflict. German, Italian, and Japanese leaders all underestimated the American military and their will to fight. For instance, before the war, Hitler wrote that America is a decayed country that is half Jew and the other half Negro. The first step Americans took against the Axis was that in March 1941, the U.S. Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, allowing the American government to supply Britain, the USSR, and China with military hardware. Tensions arose between the United States and Japan as the U.S. actively began to support Japan's enemy. In September 1941, Japan had seized control of French Indochina. The French didn't resist because Germany, who had occupied the north of metropolitan France, pressured the Vichy regime to give up her colonies in favor of the Nazis' allies. French Indochina had air bases from which the Japanese could launch attacks against the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, a British crown colony, and the Philippines. President Roosevelt was concerned and moved the Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Pearl Harbor to demonstrate American military power. He also froze Japanese assets and placed an embargo on iron supplies to put pressure on Japan. Later, he placed an embargo on other metals, technology, and oil too. Japan, being an island, heavily depended on trade, and the resource they needed most was oil. Japan imported 90% of its oil from the US, and the Japanese army estimated that within 2 years they would have run out of all supplies. Therefore, the embargo made the Japanese even more certain that they needed an empire to be self-sufficient. However, there were negotiations between the Americans and the Japanese. Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe agreed to withdraw from Indochina and China, but the army opposed it, including General Tojo, his successor as Prime Minister, when Konoe resigned shortly after the talks failed. Both the new Japanese government and the army agreed that war was unavoidable if they wanted to continue expanding their empire. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto estimated that Japan could only defeat America within the first year, therefore it needed one decisive attack which would cripple the American Navy and the soldiers' morale so much they would not be able or willing to fight a long war. At 8 a.m. on December 7, 1941, Admiral Yamamoto attacked Pearl Harbor with 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 28 submarines, and 414 airplanes, as well as several cruisers, destroyers, and tankers. The commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, was completely surprised by the assault. The U.S. Navy underestimated Japan's military technology and didn't believe they would attack that soon. Additionally, the Japanese didn't declare war. They planned to send a declaration of war half an hour before the attack, but didn't reach Washington until after Pearl Harbor's destruction. The Japanese sunk or severely damaged 7 U.S. battleships, destroyed 188 aircraft, wounded 1,178 soldiers, and killed 2,403. However, the Japanese did not destroy any aircraft carriers. The 3 American aircraft carriers stationed at Pearl Harbor, the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga, were not in the harbor during the attack. These aircraft carriers became the American Navy's most important weapons in the Pacific War. The American and Japanese battleships only rarely came close enough to one another to fight, hence both sides had to rely on their aircraft carriers. Some historians speculate that the American Navy knew about the attack and evacuated the aircraft carriers to ensure they wouldn't be destroyed. However, the American admirals were not aware of the aircraft carriers' importance in the Pacific War at this point. Like the Japanese, they assumed that battleships would be more important. Because Admiral Yamamoto was not able to destroy the aircraft carriers, the attack could not weaken the U.S. Navy enough, and his plan failed. One day after the attack, December 8, 1941, Japan began to invade the Philippines. The same day, President Roosevelt delivered a speech to Congress, his famous infamy speech.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Hitler declared war on the U.S. on December 11th. America was suddenly involved in Europe as well as in the Far East, making World War II a truly global war. Great Britain also declared war on Japan, which led to fighting in the colonies in Southeast Asia, notably the Battle of Singapore in February 1942, which Winston Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. Nevertheless, overall, Churchill was very relieved to hear the United States would become involved in the war. He later wrote, "To have the United States at our side was to me the greatest joy," and that he knew at this point that Hitler's fate was sealed. America was by far the richest and most powerful nation among the Allies, partly because of her strong economy, but also because the other Allies had already been at war for 2 years and their resources were exhausted. The US provided weapons, medical care, and food for their allies. Of course, they also sent their troops to Europe and Asia. In the Pacific, American troops won back island by island, moving towards Japan. The strategy was to avoid Japanese strongholds and conquer poorly defended yet strategically important islands. The soldiers on land were supported by airplanes, which was why aircraft carriers were so significant. Japan had focused on building traditional battleships and could not adapt to the American strategy in time. In Europe, America's direct involvement shifted the Allies from defense to offense. The Russians were advancing in the east, Allied troops began liberating Italy in 1943, and on D-Day, June 6, 1944, British, Canadian, and American troops landed at the Normandy coast. Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allies May 8, 1945, which ended war in Europe. September 2, 1945, Japan surrendered to the United States after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.